Four daughters, identical in face, identical in voice, identical in something far darker. In the early years of 20th century America, whispers traveled faster than facts. A family named Morlock vanished from public memory almost overnight, their name removed from local registries, their farmhouse abandoned, their photographs quietly archived. At the same time, across state lines, four identical sisters, later known as the Janine quadruplets, became one of the most studied psychiatric cases in modern history. Officially, the two stories were never connected. But some hospital notes were rewritten, some surnames were altered, and one doctor destroyed part of his own research before he died. Were these simply tragic coincidences, or was something experimental unfolding behind closed institutional doors? What you are about to hear is a fictional narrative inspired by historical themes and medical records of the era. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for dramatic storytelling purposes only. The Morlock house sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road outside a Midwestern township few people in Britain would recognize by name. It was the sort of farmhouse that seemed permanently coated in silence. Neighbors remembered curtains always drawn. The chimney smoked daily, yet no one recalled seeing visitors. In 1924, the local pastor recorded the birth of four girls in a single entry. No celebration was mentioned, no church gathering, only the phrase, "4 daughters delivered safely." Quadruplets were rare enough to attract newspapers, but no reporter ever arrived. Years passed, and the Morlock girls did not attend local school. Groceries were delivered irregularly. Their father paid in cash. Their mother was described only once by a neighbor as polite but distant, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then, in the winter of 1932, the Morlock house burned partially in what was labeled a stove accident. The structure survived. The family did not. Official documents stated that the Morlocks relocated to relatives in another state, yet no forwarding address existed. The land title transferred quietly to a private foundation within months. The foundation's name would later appear in hospital archives connected to psychiatric research. For decades, the Morlock surname disappeared from census records completely, erased with bureaucratic precision. Meanwhile, in medical journals published in the 1950s, four identical sisters appeared under a different name, the Janine quadruplets. They were described as a groundbreaking case study in hereditary mental illness, born in 1930, raised in a stable household, diagnosed independently with schizophrenia. Four genetically identical women, all diagnosed separately, all institutionalized. Researchers across America were fascinated, because statistically it was nearly impossible. Doctors argued the case supported theories of genetic inevitability. Funding increased. Universities praised the data. But one archivist in 1978 noticed something peculiar. Early draft paperwork referenced a different birth year, and a surname partially blacked out beneath correction ink. Morley, the rest had been deliberately obscured. If the Morlock daughters had vanished in 1932, how could four genetically identical sisters with matching timelines reappear under supervision of a medical institution years later? Had they truly relocated, or had they been absorbed into something far more clinical? The farmhouse land deed, the foundation's ownership transfer, and the psychiatric hospital's board of trustees shared one common signature: Dr. Elias Reinhardt. A respected researcher, a pioneer in genetic psychiatry. A man later celebrated in academic circles, including collaborations that reached British medical institutions. In public, he advocated compassion. In private, some former nurses described locked wings and restricted case files, but no direct evidence ever surfaced. The Morlock name remained buried, until a box of forgotten microfilms surfaced in a county archive marked with a handwritten warning, "Family file, do not circulate." Before we continue with the story and its unsettling turns, I want to ask something important. This channel is not for everyone. It is for those who are willing to question official narratives and sit with uncomfortable possibilities. If you've listened this far, consider subscribing and joining this community of thoughtful mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Could something like this have happened closer to home than we think? Next, we discover how a hospital intake form from 1933 may have rewritten the Morlock daughters' identities. Chapter 2. The intake forms. No one was meant to read. In 1933, just months after the reported relocation of the Morlock family, St. Dymphna State Hospital received 4 new patients. The intake ledger was neat, clinical, detached. All 4 were female. All 4 were approximately 3 years old. All 4 were listed as biological sisters. The surname, however, had been overwritten. Under angled light, later archivists would claim faint impressions of earlier lettering could be seen pressed into the paper, as if the first name had been scratched out with deliberate pressure before ink corrections were applied. The official record read, Janine. Their father was described as a railway clerk, their mother as deceased. The admission reason was phrased cautiously, developmental irregularities accompanied by behavioral disturbances. Yet something did not align. 3-year-olds were rarely institutionalized unless conditions were extreme. At that age, doctors usually advised observation at home. But this was not home. This was permanent residency. Financial documentation attached to the file revealed private funding. Significant funding. The source was a research endowment tied to a small foundation, the same foundation that had quietly taken ownership of the Morlock farmland the year before. That connection would remain unnoticed for decades. Hospital staff at St. Dymphna later described the sisters as eerily synchronized. They slept at similar times. They mirrored posture. They reacted to unfamiliar voices in near-perfect unison. Some nurses found it unsettling. One trainee nurse recorded in her private diary, never intended for publication, that the children were separated deliberately after intake. She wrote that Dr. Elias Reinhardt insisted each child be housed in a different ward. When questioned, he allegedly explained it was for controlled enviros. That illness was written in bloodline? Or that prolonged institutionalization from infancy shapes any mind placed within its walls? The early records never discussed their first 3 years of life in detail. There were no birth hospital certificates attached, only an amended summary signed by Dr. Reinhardt himself. And curiously, the birth date listed for the quadruplets did not align cleanly with census documents from surrounding counties. A British psychiatric journal in 1954 praised the case as groundbreaking. One London lecturer even cited the Janine sisters during a lecture at King's College, arguing it provided rare clarity in the nature versus nurture debate. What few knew was that part of the raw behavioral data had been removed from the public file before international publication. Removed by order of Reinhardt. Why redact sections of the most important psychiatric case of the decade? Why alter original intake identifiers? And why were the early childhood photographs missing from the hospital archive entirely? A retired clerk who worked in records management in the 1960s once said, years later, that she remembered 2 sets of names attached to those girls. She never elaborated. She died before anyone formally interviewed her. The official narrative remained intact. 4 identical sisters, a tragic medical rarity. Yet buried beneath typewritten clinical summaries were small fractures, discrepancies that did not appear accidental. The foundation funding, the erased surname, the immediate separation, the missing photographs. Individually they meant little. Together they formed something else, a pattern, and patterns suggest intention. Next we discover what really happened to the Morlock farmhouse after the fire, and who visited the property before it was sealed. Chapter 3. The farmhouse that would not stay silent. The Morlock farmhouse did not collapse after the stove fire of 1932. It stood, scarred, blackened along one side, but structurally sound. That detail alone should have quieted rumors. Fires that destroy lives tend to leave devastation behind. This one left walls intact, windows unbroken, the upstairs nursery untouched. For nearly 6 weeks after the reported relocation, the property remained unoccupied, officially. But one neighbor, a widower named Thomas Hale, later told his son that lights flickered inside the house long after the Morlocks were gone. Hale had been a practical man, a railway signal worker, not given to exaggeration. He insisted that on 3 separate evenings he saw a motorcar parked near the rear entrance. This was during the height of the Depression. Petrol was expensive. Rural visits were rarely casual. County records show that the land was transferred in March 1933 to the Midwestern Behavioral Research Foundation. The paperwork was processed with unusual speed. No probate delay, no public notice in the local gazette beyond a brief legal formality. What remains striking is the inventory list conducted before transfer. The majority of furniture was catalogued and removed, except for 4 small metal frame beds. Those beds were listed as non-claimable personal items and transferred separately under foundation custody. Why would a research foundation require children's bedsteads from a farmhouse? Thomas Hale also mentioned something else. He claimed that one night, before the legal transfer finalized, he heard a sharp metallic noise echo across the fields. Not the crack of wood, not the sound of livestock, but the clang of something mechanical closing, like the rear doors of a delivery vehicle. No official record supports his account, and no law enforcement report was filed. In the 1970s, when microfilm archives were digitized, an overlooked shipment record surfaced from a local freight depot. It referenced medical transport materials scheduled from the Morlock Township region to a facility operating near St. Dymphna's hospital grounds. The shipment date fell 2 weeks after the reported relocation of the family. Contents were not itemized, simply, residential transfer, 4 dependents. That phrasing was bureaucratically neutral, but it held weight. If the Morlocks had relocated voluntarily, why was a freight depot handling residential transfer of dependents to a hospital-adjacent storage facility? The local church registry offers another small crack in the story. In 1934, during an annual census of parish families, the Morlock name was marked with a faint notation. Status amended. Guardianship pending. Guardianship implies minors, not adults relocating freely. And yet no guardian paperwork exists under county files. When Thomas Hale passed away in 1968, his son discovered a small envelope inside an old metal toolbox. Inside was a photograph, the Morlock farmhouse, taken from a distance. In the upstairs window, 4 small silhouettes were visible. The photograph was dated April 1933, 1 month after the official relocation. It was never authenticated formally. It never reached press. The Sun reportedly dismissed it as a trick of light. But the timing unsettles those who study the fragments. Because in April 1933, St. Dymphna's intake registry quietly expanded its pediatric ward capacity. 4 new long-term beds were installed, and Dr. Elias Reinhardt approved a new research directive that same month, Early Onset Hereditary Observation Initiative. The initiative would later become the backbone of the Janine case study. Coincidence is always comforting, but in matters like this, coincidence begins to feel engineered. Next, we discover why Dr. Reinhardt requested sealed isolation wings for juvenile subjects in 1934. Chapter 4. The Isolation Wing. In 1934, construction began quietly on a new extension at St. Dymphna State Hospital. Officially, it was described as an observational annex designed to improve treatment conditions for vulnerable patients. The funding, once again, was routed through the Midwestern Behavioral Research Foundation. Architectural blueprints reveal something unusual. The annex was not designed like other pediatric wards of the era. Instead of shared rooms, it consisted of 4 separated suites. Each suite was self-contained. Thick walls, sound-dampened corridors, observation panels built discreetly into wooden doors, small windows positioned high enough to prevent outside visibility. Isolation, but controlled. Dr. Elias Reinhardt personally approved every specification. In correspondence with the Foundation, he wrote that the facility would allow environmental variable management without cross-contamination of behavioral patterns. Translated from clinical phrasing, it meant this: each child could be raised in near total separation from the others. By late summer, 4 young sisters were moved into the annex. Hospital payroll records indicate that special staff rotations were assigned to those rooms. Nurses were instructed not to discuss the children collectively. Each sister was referenced by a separate case number, not as siblings. Nurse Margaret Keane began her employment at St. Dymphna in October 1934. She was newly qualified, practical, observant. Years later, in retirement, she described the isolation wing as different from the rest of the hospital, quieter, more watchful, less human. She was not assigned permanently to the sisters but filled occasional shifts during staff shortages. Margaret noticed that identical toys were issued to each child, yet slight variations were introduced deliberately. One room painted pale blue, one creature one muted green, one light grey. Even meal timing differed by subtle intervals. Each child received separate schooling materials, different storybooks, different lullabies sung by nursing staff. As if someone was attempting to raise four near-identical lives under controlled divergence. Margaret once asked a senior supervisor why the girls were separated so strictly. The answer came sharp. Because if they influence each other, the study loses value. The word study lingered. In standard hospital practice, especially for siblings, emotional support between children was encouraged. Separation often worsened distress. But here, distress appeared part of the observation. Margaret began keeping small handwritten copies of behavioral notes. It was not rebellion, it was instinct. She sensed inconsistencies in official files, small edits appearing in typed summaries days after she submitted handwritten observations. On one occasion, she documented that one sister spoke clearly about a recurring dream involving a burning house and dark smoke that made mother disappear. When the weekly compiled report circulated, the reference to fire was absent, replaced with non-specific childhood anxiety imagery. Margaret clipped the original draft and stored it inside a medical textbook she kept at home. Over the years, she collected a handful of such fragments, discrepancies, alterations, softening of language. But she never reported her concerns formally. In the 1930s, challenging a senior physician, especially one nationally respected, was professionally dangerous, and Dr. Reinhardt's reputation was rising. Academic invitations increased. Papers were cited internationally. His work reached British psychiatric circles exploring genetic predisposition research during the interwar period. The Janane sisters were becoming scientific assets. Yet their earliest documented memories, burning imagery, separation distress, references to a farmhouse, were systematically diluted in official records. Margaret would later say one sentence that unsettled the archivist who interviewed her decades later. They were not born inside that hospital. They were wrought there already afraid. Next, we discover what happened when one of the sisters attempted to escape the isolation wing at age 9. Chapter 5. The Attempt. By 1939, Europe was on the brink of war. In Britain, families listened anxiously to wireless broadcasts. Across the Atlantic, life inside St. Dymphna continued behind brick walls and locked doors. The four sisters were now 9 years old. On paper, their cases had matured into structured psychiatric profiles. Each was described differently, one withdrawn, one volatile, one prone to vivid internal narratives, one unusually quiet and observant. Yet beneath those distinctions ran striking similarities, particularly when staff compared private shift notes. On the evening of October 17th, a routine check revealed that one sister, identified in restricted files as Case 3, was no longer in her bed. The corridor alarm did not sound. Windows were latched from inside. The door lock remained engaged. She was found 30 minutes later in the lower service hallway, barefoot, standing near the laundry exit. She had dismantled the inside observation panel screw using the metal spine of a hairbrush. 9 years old. When questioned gently by a junior nurse, she reportedly said something unusual. "I wanted to find the other girls." The nurse corrected her. "You mean your ward mates?" She shook her head. "My sisters." Official summaries later described the episode as an impulsive elopement attempt triggered by heightened agitation. No mention was made of the specific language she used. Margaret Keane, covering an overnight shift that week, recorded the phrasing exactly in her private notebook, because it troubled her. The sisters had been instructed from early childhood not to refer to one another as siblings. That word had been systematically phased out of internal documentation. Staff were corrected if they used it in earshot of patients. And yet, despite isolation, despite environmental separation, despite controlled divergence, the idea of sisterhood had not vanished. Within days of the escape attempt, new security measures appeared. Door hardware was reinforced, hallway patrol schedules intensified, and most significantly, supervised exposure sessions were introduced. Once per month, each sister would be escorted individually to a neutral observation chamber. There, through a one-way screen, she would briefly see one of the others without physical contact. The purpose was recorded as controlled visual reintroduction. But what unsettles modern readers of the archive is this: none of the four were told beforehand they would see another child. The reactions were carefully documented: elevated pulse rates, tears, confusion, recognition. Recognition, even after years apart. Dr. Reinhardt drafted an internal research paper in early 1940 titled Divergent Development Under Isolated Genetic Constants. In early versions, a paragraph referenced pre-institutional trauma indicators. In the final draft, that paragraph was removed. The paper was submitted to a National Psychiatric Review Board, then quietly withdrawn weeks later. No explanation given. A carbon copy of the earlier draft, however, remained clipped within Margaret Keene's collected fragments. The phrase that had been removed read, "Early environmental destabilization may confound genetic determinism conclusions." In simpler terms, whatever happened before hospital intake could not be ignored. If the Morlock farmhouse fire was more than a stove accident, if the children experienced upheaval prior to admission, then the experiment's premise was compromised from the beginning. War would soon dominate global headlines. Attention shifted elsewhere. Funding for psychological research often increased during wartime, particularly when linked to understanding mental resilience and breakdown, and the sisters remained in isolation. But cracks had begun to form, not in their behavior, but in the narrative surrounding them. Next, we discover the British conference in 1943, where Reinhardt presented altered findings.
Chapter 6. The Conference. Across the Atlantic. In 1943, while London endured blackout curtains and air raid sirens, a psychiatric conference convened quietly in Manchester. Wartime Britain had not suspended scientific exchange entirely. On the contrary, the pressures of conflict had intensified interest in the human mind, resilience, breakdown, hereditary predisposition. Among the invited speakers was Dr. Elias Reinhardt. Travel during wartime was restricted, but medical research carried weight. His presentation was titled Genetic Predictability in Severe Psychotic Expression. It drew particular interest because of one case study: 4 identical sisters raised under varied environmental conditions, each developing parallel psychiatric symptoms. The audience listened carefully. Britain, grappling with trauma among civilians and soldiers alike, was deeply invested in understanding whether mental illness could be anticipated through bloodline. Reinhardt's slides displayed structured graphs, clean data tables, simplified behavioral timelines. He described separation from early infancy, independent development, converging diagnosis. He did not mention a farmhouse. He did not mention fire imagery. He did not mention the escape attempt. Nor did he disclose that pre-admission documentation had been amended. Several British psychiatrists in attendance later referenced his work when discussing genetic susceptibility in wartime mental collapse. One lecturer from Edinburgh called the case disturbingly conclusive, but not everyone was convinced. A junior researcher reviewing Reinhardt's distributed summary noticed something absent. There were no direct maternal or paternal psychiatric histories included in the published data, unusual for a hereditary claim of that magnitude. When asked during a private reception whether family background supported his thesis, Reinhardt reportedly replied, "The environment is often misremembered by families. Genetics rarely lies." It was a line that lingered. Back at St. Dymphna, the sisters were entering adolescence. Institutional adolescence in particular can sharpen tension, identity fragments under prolonged observation, emotional development competes with confinement. In 1944, a nurse assigned to educational duties discovered a folded page tucked between arithmetic exercises in one sister's workbook. It was not a clinical note. It was a letter. The handwriting was uneven, but deliberate. "We were not born here. There was a red room upstairs. Mother sang quietly when father was away. I remember smoke, but not fire. If someone reads this, please tell the other 3 that I remember." The letter was unsigned. Before it could be filed, it was forwarded directly to Reinhardt. The document never appeared in official archives again. Yet Margaret Keane would later confirm she saw it once, briefly, before it was removed. By 1946, war in Europe had ended. Britain was rebuilding. Scientific exchange resumed at full scale. Reinhardt's reputation grew. Articles cited the Genain sisters as textbook illustration of genetic inevitability. But inside the hospital walls, subtle resistance had begun to stir. The sisters, despite separation, began showing synchronized behavioral shifts, increased agitation during identical calendar periods, repeated references to shared childhood imagery. It was as though something beneath institutional layering refused to dissolve. Reinhardt's next proposal was bold. He sought permission for intensified observational protocols, including pharmacological trials intended to stabilize symptom progression. Funding applications were approved swiftly, because by then the case was too valuable to question publicly. But privately, doubts were accumulating, and doubts can become dangerous when suppressed long enough. Next, we discover what happened during the first medication trial in 1947. Chapter 7. The Name That Slipped Through. By the winter of 1947, the world outside St. Dymphna was rebuilding. Cities scarred by war were stitching themselves together again. Ration books were still common in Britain. Families were piecing together new beginnings from old rubble. Inside the hospital annex, time felt different, slower, controlled, artificial. The sisters were 17. The approved pharmacological trial began quietly. Sedative compounds were adjusted incrementally under medical supervision. Doses were logged carefully. Behavior was charted against time, weather, menstrual cycles, external stimuli. To outside observers, it resembled progress. To those inside the ward, it felt like tightening fog. Within weeks, side effects began to surface. Tremors, slowed speech, flattening of emotional expression. The official summaries described the responses as within tolerable limits. But Margaret Keane, still collecting fragments in private, noted something else. She wrote, "They are less volatile, but also less themselves." One evening in February, during a routine pulse check, Case 2, usually withdrawn, gripped the sleeve of a trainee nurse and whispered a single word. "Morlock." The nurse hesitated. It was not in any of the educational materials she had reviewed. She assumed it was fragmented speech. "What was that?" she asked gently. The girl repeated it, slower this time. "Morlock, that was our name." The trainee reported the exchange through standard channels. Within hours, the note had been removed from her shift ledger. She was reassigned to another wing the following week. Margaret later learned of the incident indirectly. The trainee confided in her during a tearful lunch break. She feared she had done something wrong. Margaret reassured her. But that night she searched the older intake registry again. Specifically the page show, invisible impression marks beneath the overwritten surname. Under angled desk light, she could just make out the faint indentation of letters beginning with M-O-R. She traced them gently with the tip of her finger. The following morning, additional clerical adjustments were made to the Genain files. Birth locations were standardized, early childhood history simplified further, parental occupation fields shortened to vague references, and a new internal directive circulated quietly among senior staff. Avoid speculative engagement regarding patient origin narratives. Speculative engagement. That phrasing felt deliberate, as if memory itself was being classified as contamination. The medication trial continued through spring. Publicly, Reinhardt presented preliminary results suggesting improved stabilization across genetically identical subjects, reinforcing his thesis. Privately, staff turnover increased within the Annex. Too many questions, too many edits, too many coincidences aligning too neatly. Margaret's collection of private notes had grown thick enough to fill a small leather folder. She had no clear plan for it, only a sense that someone someday might need proof that the official version had not told the full story. In late 1947, one final development unsettled even the most disciplined staff member. All 4 sisters in separate rooms within the span of 2 weeks independently described the same dream. A farmhouse, smoke drifting across frozen fields, a locked upstairs door. None of them had access to one another's therapy sessions, none shared common reading materials. Yet the imagery matched in striking detail. Reinhardt's response was clinical, convergent delusional architecture under shared genetic predisposition. But Margaret wrote something simpler. You cannot erase the beginning of a life by renaming it. The word Morlock had resurfaced. And once spoken aloud, it could not be entirely unspoken. Next, we discover the sealed Foundation documents uncovered after Reinhardt suffered a sudden medical emergency. Chapter 8. The drawer marked pre-admission. In the autumn of 1948, Dr. Elias Reinhardt suffered what newspapers described as a minor cardiac episode. It was not fatal, but it removed him from St. Dymphna's daily operations for several weeks. For the first time in nearly 15 years, administrative control shifted temporarily to the hospital board. In most institutions, such transitions pass without incident. At St. Dymphna, it created a narrow window. Reinhardt's private study inside the annex was modest in appearance. Oak desk, locked cabinet, shelves of journals from America and Britain alike, nothing outwardly dramatic. Yet when a junior administrator was tasked with inventorying research materials during his leave, she noticed a lower drawer secured separately from the rest. The key was not found on Reinhardt's keyring. It was discovered taped beneath the interior ledge of the desk. Inside the drawer were 3 slim folders, no decorative labels, only handwritten tags. Environmental baseline, Foundation correspondence, pre-admission. The administrator would later claim she hesitated before opening the last. Inside were carbon copies of transport receipts dated March and April 1933. A rural freight invoice listing 4 female miners, supervised transfer. A notarized guardianship waiver signed not by a parent, but by a representative of the Midwestern Behavioral Research Foundation. No adoption record, no death certificate for the mother, no verified paternal consent. And clipped to the back of the file, partially burned along one corner, was a photograph. The Morlock farmhouse, clearer than the one Thomas Hale's son once found. This image showed the rear of the house, a motorcar parked discreetly near a side entrance, a man standing beside it, his face partially turned away but unmistakable to anyone familiar with hospital staff portraits. Reinhardt. The date, stamped faintly along the margin, February 1933, 1 month before official relocation. There was also a handwritten memo, early removal necessary, paternal resistance escalating, fire incident accelerates transfer timeline. No signature, no explanation, but enough to fracture the public narrative beyond repair. Before the administrator could duplicate the materials, Reinhardt returned to duty sooner than expected. His recovery had been described as rapid. Within days, the locked drawer contents were relocated. The board received a brief internal memo stating that early research materials required consolidation under principal investigator oversight. The drawer remained empty thereafter. But something irreversible had occurred. Because the administrator, unsettled by what she had glimpsed, mentioned the contents during a private conversation with a board member sympathetic to procedural transparency. That board member requested a formal audit of Foundation Hospital financial intersections. The audit request was quietly deferred. Funding, after all, was generous. The Genane study had become internationally referenced. Reputations were interwoven across institutions, including respected psychiatric circles in Britain still rebuilding post-war medical systems. No one wanted a scandal tied to a flagship case. Meanwhile, inside the Annex, the sisters approached adulthood. Their diagnostic profiles were now presented as conclusive proof of hereditary inevitability. Yet beneath heavy sedation and carefully structured routines, memory continued pressing outward. One sister began repeating a phrase during supervised writing sessions. "We were moved before the smoke cleared." When asked to clarify, she would fall silent. Reinhardt, ever controlled, dismissed such remarks as symbolic confabulation. But privately, his health seemed more fragile than before, and fragile men guarding secrets often tighten their grip. Next, we discover what the Foundation audit finally revealed in 1951. Chapter 9. The Audit That Never Was. By 1951, Dr. Reinhardt's health had deteriorated further, though he continued to maintain a commanding presence at St. Dymphna. Behind his composed exterior, subtle tremors in hand and voice betrayed mounting stress. Perhaps he understood that the walls he had built around his work were not as impenetrable as he believed. The Foundation audit, requested years earlier, finally reached the board's agenda. It was designed to examine financial transfers between the Midwestern Behavioral Research Foundation and St. Dymphna, particularly funds tied to childcare, transportation, and research materials. The auditors were instructed to trace every expenditure linked to early 1930s pediatric cases. What they found was curious. Receipts for residential transfers existed. Freight manifests, lodging expenses, and hospital admission costs were meticulously logged. But the accompanying legal documentation was incomplete. Some signatures were illegible, others clearly overwritten. Original birth certificates and parental consents were absent. More strikingly, a series of notes filed under pre-admission protocols referenced 4 minors by their original surname, Morlock, before being redacted and replaced with Genane. The audit team questioned Reinhardt directly. He responded with calm deflection. All early records were archived for confidentiality. Any discrepancies are administrative artifacts, he said. The board member who had requested the audit, Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, a man respected in London psychiatric circles, noted privately that Reinhardt's explanation was insufficient. Yet the full board, wary of public scandal and concerned with ongoing funding, chose to table the matter indefinitely. Documents later surfaced in private correspondence, indicating that some board members were uneasy. They warned that the missing early records could compromise scientific credibility if ever exposed, yet public papers continued to cite the Genane sisters as textbook evidence of genetic predisposition, their histories presented as flawless case studies. Meanwhile, the sisters, now approaching their early 20s, displayed patterns of behavior too consistent to dismiss. Observers noted subtle communication cues between them, gestures, expressions, fleeting phrases, despite years of enforced separation. It was as if some shared memory persisted, embedded so deeply it could not be erased by walls, medication, or rewritten files. Margaret Keane, now retired, would later remark, "They tried to control everything, their names, their rooms, their memories, but you cannot erase the beginning of a life, and sometimes memory finds a way to speak, quietly, if necessary, but persistently." Next, we discover the confidential medical notes discovered decades later that reveal shared childhood recollections between the sisters.
Did you know, in psychiatric science, the Genane quadruplets are a well-documented case of 4 identical sisters who all developed schizophrenia, making their situation extremely rare and scientifically significant. Because they shared the same genes but experienced different life experiences, researchers studied them closely to explore how nature, genetics, and nurture, environment, influence mental illness. Their case was studied by the US National Institute of Mental Health in the 1950s, and researchers returned to follow them again decades later. finding that while all four developed schizophrenia, the severity and expression of their illness varied among them. This has made their story one of the most referenced case studies in understanding the complex interplay between genetics and mental health.
Chapter 10. Whispers Between the Lines. By the mid-1950s, the Janane sisters had become subjects of ongoing observation. Officially, they were patients under lifetime study, their psychiatric conditions framed as hereditary inevitability. In practice, they were living experiments, carefully monitored, quietly separated, yet intrinsically connected in ways the staff struggled to quantify. Margaret Keane, who had retired several years prior, received an unexpected letter from a former colleague. It contained photocopies of medical notes she had never seen. Typed in Reinhardt's familiar hand, the annotations detailed subtle behavioral correspondences among the sisters, shared phrases, mirroring body language, even recurring dreams referencing the farmhouse and smoke. One excerpt, particularly chilling, described the sisters' simultaneous recollection of an event that had never been recorded in hospital files. A night where a fire, small yet alarming, occurred at their place of birth, and a figure referred to as father had been present. The line was immediately followed by a correction in blue ink. Reference removed, irrelevant to study. These notes implied that memories of the Morlock farmhouse and their early trauma persisted despite enforced separation, altered surnames, and manipulated records. The sisters' awareness of one another and of their past could not be fully suppressed. The Foundation continued to fund Reinhardt's research aggressively, citing the Janane study as the pinnacle of psychiatric genetic investigation. Publicly, the sisters were anonymized, their childhoods sanitized. Privately, archivists noted inconsistencies, striking out names, altering timelines, and blacking out references. Margaret, reading the notes decades later, wrote in her journal, "Every deletion, every redaction, every isolated room was an attempt to erase not only Naïn, Mez, but the essence of a shared childhood. They couldn't." This was the beginning of the slow unraveling. The memory fragments, whispered between lines of official documentation, hinted at a deeper story, one that would continue to emerge as decades passed, waiting for those curious enough to piece the fragments together. Next, we discover the British academic who uncovered the altered drafts of Reinhardt's unpublished paper.
Chapter 11. The Drafts That Should Not Exist. In 1962, nearly a decade after the sisters had reached adulthood, Dr. Malcolm Harrington, a British psychiatrist attending a medical archive review in Edinburgh, stumbled upon a series of drafts in a locked cabinet labelled simply, Reinhardt Papers, Confidential. The drafts were striking. Handwritten notes, interspersed with typed commentary, detailed the longitudinal study of four sisters, referred to in some passages by their original surname, Morlock. Margins were crowded with annotations correcting dates, redacting references to early childhood events, and altering descriptions of familial interactions. One paragraph stood out. It referenced an incident involving partial fire damage at the farmhouse residence prior to admission and implied that early environmental destabilization may confound genetic interpretations. The line was heavily crossed out in ink, as though even Reinhardt hesitated to acknowledge it. Harrington recognized the implications immediately. The official publications he had studied in London and Edinburgh claimed the Janane sisters' childhoods were neutral, standardized, controlled environments. These drafts told a different story. Further, multiple letters from the Foundation indicated a deliberate policy. All pre-admission records must be corrected or withheld, maintain narrative continuity for scientific publications. This was not oversight. It was orchestration. Harrington copied the drafts, keeping them in a private folder. Over the next several months, he compared them with published articles and found dozens of discrepancies, altered birth dates, modified parental references, missing childhood incidents. The evidence painted a picture that public archives did not admit. The Janane sisters' lives had been carefully rewritten, their histories sanitized to support a predetermined scientific narrative. Even more striking was an early note referring to an isolated observational environment and a cryptic warning. Do not disclose cross-sibling interactions, may compromise experimental integrity. The sisters' separations, their altered names, even their medications, were all part of a controlled design intended to observe what Reinhardt considered the pure expression of hereditary mental illness, yet it disregarded the humanity of the children involved. Harrington later wrote in his personal reflections, "The more I studied the material, the more apparent it became that truth and science had diverged here. Behind the clinical language were real lives, manipulated, hidden, rewritten." Next, we discover the nurse who secretly preserved photographs and notes, defying hospital orders. Chapter 12. The Nurse Who Remembered. In 1965, long after her retirement, Margaret Keene's name surfaced in a quiet correspondence among archival researchers. She had been one of the few nurses assigned to the isolation wing in the 1930s and 1940s, the one who had meticulously kept handwritten notes about the sisters, notes that contradicted official files and recorded moments erased from formal records. Margaret had never intended her documentation to be public. Her notes were personal, a silent record of what she had witnessed, the synchronized behaviors, the whispered names, the recurring memories of a farmhouse, the fire, and the father whose presence loomed in recollections. But as Reinhardt's papers were rediscovered by Dr. Harrington, archivists realized her accounts could provide context to the redacted drafts. Among her preserved materials were photographs taken surreptitiously, the sisters in separate rooms, toys arranged identically, but with subtle variations, the early corridors of the isolation wing, and even one image of the farmhouse visible through a nurse's distant observation window. Each image seemed mundane, yet together they told a story that official records obscured. Margaret also included a brief diary entry about the night Case 3 had attempted to escape at age 9. She described the child standing barefoot in the hallway, whispering about her sisters, an event later erased from hospital records. Another note documented the sisters' shared dream imagery: smoke, a locked upstairs door, and flickering lights, which had persisted despite years of isolation. Her careful preservation of these materials defied hospital directives and Reinhardt's insistence on secrecy. It was one of the few ways that traces of their early lives remained intact. Margaret's files would later become crucial for researchers trying to reconstruct a history deliberately fragmented. They hinted at the emotional truth behind the clinical narrative, that 4 identical sisters had survived controlled separation, rewritten identities, and deliberate erasure of memory, and yet still retained fragments of a shared past. Next, we discover the first sister who publicly spoke about her childhood. Chapter 13. The First Voice. By the early 1970s, one of the Genine sisters had reached her mid-40s. She had spent decades within institutional walls, largely under observation and treatment. Publicly, she was anonymized. Privately, her memories were fragmented, colored by sedation, isolation, and rewritten records. In 1972, a British journalist researching hereditary psychiatry in America contacted the hospital requesting interviews. The sisters were asked if they wished to participate. Reluctantly, one agreed. She spoke slowly, carefully, aware that every word might be recorded and interpreted. Her first words startled the researcher. "They never wanted us to remember, but I do. I remember a house, smoke, mother singing, father somewhere. Gone?" She paused, eyes distant. The phrasing echoed Margaret Keene's decades-old notes. Then she added a single word, whispered almost under her breath, "Morlock." The journalist hesitated. She asked again, gently, "Morlock?" "Yes. That was our name before it was taken." The interview lasted less than 30 minutes, but it confirmed something remarkable. Despite decades of enforced separation, name changes, and record redactions, fragments of the sisters' original identities had persisted. Their memories were not fully erased. The institutional narrative, rewritten for publication, research, and prestige, had failed to extinguish personal history. Further notes from the interview revealed small details: the synchronized gestures still present when the sisters were together, recurring dreams referencing the farmhouse, and subtle recognition of shared toys and spaces despite official claims of isolation. These accounts corresponded almost exactly to the redacted drafts discovered by Dr. Harrington and the photographs preserved by Margaret Keene. This first public acknowledgement, even private behind closed doors, hinted at a larger truth. The sisters' early years, the Morlock farmhouse, the fire, the separation, and the Foundation's manipulation were all connected. What had been systematically removed from official records and clinical publications could not be fully obliterated from memory. Next, we discover how archival researchers uncovered previously unseen correspondence between Reinhardt and the Foundation. Chapter 14. The correspondence never meant to be seen. In 1975, as archival research into psychiatric history intensified, a small cache of letters surfaced in a previously overlooked Foundation repository. The envelopes were yellowed, some brittle along the edges. Each bore the unmistakable handwriting of Dr. Elias Reinhardt, addressed to the Midwestern Behavioral Research Foundation. The letters contained directives that, if publicly known, would have shocked the psychiatric community. Reinhardt outlined in meticulous detail the reasoning behind the sisters' enforced separation, the alteration of their surname, and the strategic redaction of pre-admission events. One passage was particularly striking. Early environmental instability must be classified as neutral for longitudinal purposes. All recollections of pre-admission incidents are to be treated as non-evaluable. Any staff notes that reference the original surname must be corrected immediately. Another letter instructed staff to monitor subtle cross-sibling interactions and to suppress any indications of recognition. Photographs, diaries, or other personal records were to be archived separately, away from routine review, and destroyed if deemed contaminating. The correspondence revealed a chilling clarity. The sisters were not merely patients under observation, they were part of a controlled experiment that extended beyond conventional ethical boundaries. Their experiences were curated, altered, and sanitized to maintain the narrative Reinhardt wished to present to the scientific world. Interestingly, the letters also reference the Morlock farmhouse and a minor fire incident, confirming that early childhood events had indeed occurred prior to hospital admission, events that were deliberately excluded from any published study. For Dr. Harrington and others reviewing the letters, the implications were undeniable. The sisters' histories had been manipulated to support a predetermined scientific conclusion that genetics alone dictated psychiatric outcomes. Environmental and traumatic factors were systematically erased from the official record. Yet despite these deliberate efforts, the sisters' own memories, whispered in private letters, documented by Margaret Keane and finally spoken decades later, persisted. They resisted the imposed narrative. Next, we discover the first time multiple sisters communicated directly with each other after decades of isolation. Chapter 15. The Sisters Speak. By 1978, the Jenane sisters were in their late 40s. Years of controlled observation, isolation, and medication had left their lives largely confined to hospital routines. Publicly, they were anonymized case studies. Privately, they retained fragments of their shared past. For the first time since childhood, the sisters were allowed limited supervised contact. The Foundation, perhaps unaware of the depth of their memory retention, assumed the reunion would be clinically neutral. Instead, it became revelatory. During a quiet afternoon in a neutral observation chamber, the sisters began speaking. First in hesitant murmurs, then more openly, they described overlapping memories of a farmhouse, of smoke drifting across the fields, of a father's presence during fearful nights, and of a mother singing softly despite chaos. The synchronization of their memories was uncanny. Despite being raised separately and receiving different materials, the events they recalled matched almost exactly. One sister even recited the same words her childhood diary had captured. They were trying to change our names, but we remembered. Morlock. That was our name. Their recollections contradicted decades of clinical publications and redacted hospital files. Where official documents claimed neutrality and standardization, the sisters' own testimonies revealed trauma, fire, separation, and deliberate manipulation. Margaret Keane, still alive and informed by her preserved notes, confirmed the accuracy of their memories. She wrote that the sisters had resisted erasure simply by remembering themselves and each other. This moment marked a turning point. The sisters' voices, once suppressed, now challenged the narrative Reinhardt and the Foundation had meticulously curated. For the first time, the truth began to emerge, not from clinical data, but from lived experience. Next, we discover how Reinhardt reacted when he learned the sisters' recollections were being documented.
Chapter 16. Reinhardt's Reaction. By 1980, Dr. Elias Reinhardt was an aging figure, still commanding respect in psychiatric circles, but increasingly isolated from public scrutiny. The Foundation had grown dependent on the Genan case study's prestige. Publications, lectures, and grants were tied to the narrative he had carefully shaped over decades. When he learned that the sisters' testimonies were being documented, private interviews, personal letters, and corroborating notes from Margaret Keane, he became unusually defensive. Researchers noted he requested the immediate review of any material related to pre-admission history. He insisted that nothing questioning the Genan case should reach public forums without his explicit approval. Several letters, recovered later by archivists, reveal his mindset. One reads, "Any dissemination of unsanctioned personal recollections undermines decades of work. Control over narrative must be maintained. Original files, if unguarded, may compromise both institutional integrity and scientific credibility." Another letter, marked urgent, instructed staff to monitor former nurses and archivists who had retained notes. Ensure all documents outside official archives are accounted for. Any external references to Morlock material are to be flagged immediately. Discretion is paramount. Despite these measures, the sisters' voices persisted. Interviews continued. Copies of Keane's notes circulated quietly among select researchers. Even decades of separation and enforced isolation had failed to erase the shared memories. Reinhardt's attempts to suppress information exposed a deeper truth, that controlling data alone could not erase the reality of lived experience. The sisters' recollections challenged the very foundation of his work. Margaret Keane reflected privately. They thought memory could be erased with locks, redactions, and separation. But memory is stubborn, and shared memory is stronger still. Next, we discover the series of forgotten photographs that captured the sisters together, moments never acknowledged in hospital files. Chapter 17. The Forgotten Photographs. In 1982, a small collection of photographs was discovered in an unmarked archive within St. Dymphna State Hospital. They had been stored in a cardboard box labeled only with a date range, 1950-1960. No captions, no explanations. The images were striking. 4 sisters, seated separately yet visibly interacting through subtle gestures. Their eyes met across rooms. Hands mirrored one another unconsciously. Small toys, identical yet slightly varied in color or placement, appeared in each frame, the same toys Margaret Keane had documented decades earlier. One photograph in particular captured a moment in which the sisters laughed simultaneously. Official hospital files had never reported such expressions of shared emotion. Reinhardt's published studies described them as emotionally flat and socially constrained. The photos revealed the truth. Despite the enforced separation, the controlled environmental variables, and decades of observation, the sisters retained an intrinsic connection, an unspoken communication that no amount of institutional control could sever. Researchers later noted small annotations on the backs of the photographs, nearly imperceptible pencil marks, describing recurring gestures, shared glances, and mirroring behaviors. These notations aligned perfectly with Margaret Keane's private notes and the sisters' own recollections. The photographs became crucial evidence in understanding the divergence between the official narrative and lived reality. They demonstrated that despite manipulation, renaming, and isolation, the sisters' shared history persisted, quietly defying the narrative Reinhardt had constructed. Next, we discover the private diary entries that revealed the sisters' awareness of their orchestrated lives. Chapter 18. We Remember. By the mid-1980s, the Genan sisters were in their 50s. Though their lives had been shaped by decades of observation, medication, and separation, the core of their shared identity persisted. In private interviews, one sister repeatedly uttered the same haunting phrase, "We remember." The repetition was not idle. It referred to a life deliberately edited from official records. The Morlock farmhouse, the fire, the father, the mother's songs, the separation, and even the altered names. For decades, the world had been told a story that never matched reality. Yet their memories remained intact, whispered across time and space, despite institutional efforts to suppress them. Private diaries discovered in the hospital archives revealed the sisters' acute awareness of being observed. Entries described their strategies for communicating silently, mirroring gestures, and preserving fragments of shared memory. One passage reads, "Even when apart, we know. Even when they try to rewrite us, our memories persist. We are four, yet one. We remember." Margaret Keene's preserved notes corroborated these accounts. Her observations from decades earlier had recorded the same mirrored behaviors, the same recognition of shared experiences, and the same quiet, persistent knowledge of their original family name. The phrase, "we remember," became more than a mantra. It was a quiet rebellion against the meticulously constructed narrative of Reinhardt and the Foundation. It proved that despite enforced isolation, altered documentation, and decades of psychiatric observation, lived experience cannot be fully erased. Next, we discover how the sisters' collective recollections finally challenged the Foundation's official narrative. Chapter 19, The Final Letters. By the late 1980s, Dr. Elias Reinhardt was in poor health. His career, once untouchable, had begun to show cracks. Researchers, archivists, and journalists had started to piece together the suppressed fragments. Margaret Keene's notes, forgotten photographs, pre-admission drafts, and now the sisters' own voices, forming a mosaic that contradicted decades of official records. Reinhardt's last surviving letters, discovered posthumously, were stark. Handwritten on thin stationery, the correspondence reflected a man both meticulous and fearful. One letter to the Foundation reads, "I have observed persistent resistance in the subject's recollections. Even with environmental control and documentation revisions, the original histories persist. Any exposure risks undermining the entire body of work. I advise extreme discretion." Another, more revealing, addressed the hospital board. "The narrative we have curated must remain unchallenged publicly. Unauthorized accounts, interviews, or photographs must be contained. The integrity of the research depends on perception as much as data." These letters exposed a fundamental truth. Reinhardt had long understood that the sisters' memories could not be fully suppressed. For all his meticulous control, the separation, medication, renaming, and redactions, he feared the inevitable revelation of the truth. Decades later, historians and journalists piecing together the archives realized that the Morlock farmhouse, the pre-admission trauma, the synchronized behaviors, and the whispered memories of Morlock had never been eradicated. They survived through personal recollection, preserved notes, and discrete photographs. The story of the Genine sisters was never just a clinical case study. It was a testament to resilience, memory, and the human spirit resisting erasure. The Final Letters, combined wit, with Margaret Keene's observations and the sisters' own testimonies, painted a chilling yet illuminating picture, a controlled experiment that attempted to overwrite human identity but ultimately failed. Next, we reflect on the legacy of the Genine sisters and the unanswered ethical questions their story leaves behind.